Hello, guys.
Because of my golden brother, I neglected the family cruise because I was obviously getting lost against my brother due to favoritism. It's always been about James. From the moment we were kids, he was the golden child, and I was just there. No matter what James did, or didn't do, it was excused or ignored. Meanwhile, every little mistake I made was treated like a catastrophe. When James got caught selling pills in high school, it was brushed off as a phase. My parents rallied around him, talking about supporting him through a rough patch. But when I got caught smoking weed at a party, they acted like I'd committed a felony, threatening to kick me out and grounding me for weeks. James dropped out of college 3 times, and each time, our parents reassured him he was just finding himself. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs to get through school and still graduated late. Instead of celebrating my hard work, they focused on how I should have finished on time. Now James still doesn't have a job and lives off our parents, while I've built a stable life entirely on my own. Despite everything, James remains their pride and joy. They call him creative and misunderstood, while I'm just fine, not worth their time or attention. The breaking point came this Thanksgiving. My parents planned a family cruise and bought tickets for themselves, James, and his girlfriend. When I asked about my ticket, they told me to buy my own because I have a good job. James, of course, got a luxury suite. I tried to tell them how unfair it felt. Instead of listening, they hit me with their favorite line, "Green isn't a good look on you." That was it. I realized I didn't have to keep trying to prove myself to people who clearly didn't care. I decided right then that I was done playing second fiddle. After that conversation, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment they made me feel like I didn't matter. This cruise wasn't just about the tickets, it was a culmination of years of being overlooked and undervalued. I realized I didn't owe them anything anymore, not even the courtesy of pretending I was okay. But I didn't want to just skip the trip. No, I wanted them to understand how it felt to be excluded, to be blindsided, to realize that maybe I wasn't as fine as they'd convinced themselves. So, I made a plan. I told my parents I'd join them on the cruise. "Don't worry, I'll book my own ticket," I said, smiling through gritted teeth. Of course, they didn't offer to help, just nodded as if that was the obvious thing to do. James smirked in the background, likely imagining me in a cramped room while he enjoyed his suite. For weeks, I let them believe I was going. I even chimed in on the group texts about packing lists and excursions. But behind the scenes, I was making other plans. My girlfriend, Emily, had invited me to spend Thanksgiving with her family. At first, I hesitated, I didn't want to impose. But she insisted, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I needed a break from my own family's chaos. On the morning of the trip, I sent them a single text: "Since you didn't want to put the effort into including me, I'll be spending Thanksgiving with Emily's family instead. Have fun with your favorite child." Then, I muted the chat. I wasn't sure how they'd react, but I knew one thing: I finally felt in control. Thanksgiving with Emily's family was a revelation. From the moment I walked through the door, I was greeted with hugs, smiles, and warmth, things I hadn't experienced in years. Her mom insisted on setting an extra plate at the table even though they'd already prepared enough food for an army. Her dad immediately offered me a beer and invited me to join him and her uncles in the kitchen as they argued over the best way to fry a turkey. It was chaos, but it was the good kind. The kind where people actually cared about each other, where laughter echoed through the house and no one was walking on eggshells. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself or compete for attention. At dinner, Emily's mom pulled me aside and said, "You're always welcome here, you know. We'd love to have you as part of the family one day." I smiled and thanked her, but inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, a feeling I'd been chasing my whole life. Meanwhile, my phone was blowing up. Text after text from my parents and James came flooding in. At first, they were confused. "What do you mean you're not coming?" Then came the guilt trips. "Do you have any idea how selfish this is?" And, of course, my mom's favorite line: "You've ruined our holiday." I didn't respond. Not to any of them. I knew engaging would just lead to more arguments, more dismissals, and more frustration. Instead, I spent the day surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me. That night, as I sat by the fireplace with Emily, her younger cousins trying to teach us a ridiculous card game, I realized something: this was what family was supposed to feel like. No judgment, no drama, just love. It made me question everything I'd been holding on to. The next morning, I finally braced myself to check my phone. Predictably, the group chat was in shambles. James was the first to respond, accusing me of being immature and petty, painting my decision as an embarrassing betrayal of the family. My dad chimed in next, his message short and sharp, expressing disappointment and implying I'd let them down. Then came my mom, in typical fashion, with a long, emotional message about how I'd broken her heart by abandoning them on a holiday meant for family. It was exhausting to read, but none of it surprised me. They didn't ask why I had made this choice or acknowledge their role in pushing me to it. It was the same script as always: deflect, guilt, and gaslight. What did catch me off guard, though, was James's girlfriend stepping into the fray. She defended me, saying she understood why I'd chosen not to come. "You guys don't treat him right," she'd written. It was the smallest of validations, but it made me feel seen for the first time in years. Later in the day, my mom called. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her voice wavered between anger and hurt as she asked how I could do this to them, turning a family holiday into a spectacle. She tried to justify their actions, insisting they loved me but needed to focus on James because he still needed support. It was the same refrain I'd heard my whole life: James's struggles were always prioritized, and I was supposed to be the one who didn't need anything. When I calmly explained how the years of neglect had worn me down, she brushed it off, saying I was being dramatic. Eventually, her tone hardened, accusing me of being cruel and selfish for letting them believe I'd be there, only to bail at the last moment. I didn't deny that it was a calculated decision, but I stood by it. I was done bending over backward for a family that wouldn't do the same for me. For once, I ended the conversation on my terms. Despite the weight of the fallout, there was a quiet strength in finally choosing myself. After the call with my mom, I couldn't help but reflect on the years leading up to this moment. It wasn't just about the cruise or Thanksgiving, it was a lifetime of being the second priority. I thought back to all the times I had tried to be enough for them. From childhood to now, I had bent over backward to gain their approval, only to be dismissed or compared unfavorably to James. Every milestone in my life had been overshadowed by his needs or failures. When I graduated, they barely showed up, but when James dropped out, again, they rallied around him with sympathy. My achievements were just a footnote in their lives, while his struggles became the headline. I had told myself for years that their behavior didn't bother me, but the truth was, it cut deeper than I let on. Spending Thanksgiving with Emily's family had been eye-opening. For once, I saw what unconditional love looked like, what it felt like to be accepted for who I was without needing to prove myself. Her family didn't care about my job, my accomplishments, or my failures. They just cared about making me feel welcome. The contrast was almost too much to process. It made me realize just how much I had been starving for that kind of support. I wasn't bitter about my family anymore, I was just tired. Tired of chasing something they would never give me. For the first time, I began to seriously consider what cutting ties might look like, not in a dramatic, never speak to them again way, but in a quiet decision to prioritize my own well-being. Maybe it was time to stop investing so much energy into a relationship that only seemed to drain me. In the days that followed, my mind was a mess of unanswered questions and emotions I couldn't quite pin down. I kept asking myself, what was I holding onto by trying to stay close to my family? Was it loyalty, obligation, or just some naive hope that one day they'd wake up and see me for who I was? Even though I'd taken a stand by skipping the cruise, I couldn't help feeling a pang of guilt. It wasn't that I didn't care about my family, quite the opposite. I had spent my entire life craving their approval and hoping for their love to feel as unconditional as the love they showered on James. I wasn't trying to hurt them by choosing myself for once. I just wanted them to understand how much their actions had hurt me over the years. But deep down, I knew that day might never come. The texts from my parents kept rolling in, each one hitting me in a different way. My dad sent one particularly cutting message, accusing me of disrespecting everything they'd done for me. He rattled off a list of their supposed sacrifices, things like paying for my education or giving me a roof over my head growing up, as if those basic responsibilities absolved them of their blatant favoritism. It stung because I knew, in their minds, they thought they'd done everything right. They didn't see the imbalance the way I did, and maybe they never would. James's messages, though, were a different beast entirely. He wasn't trying to guilt me, he was outright attacking me. He called me bitter, selfish, and jealous of his life, which would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating. Jealous? Of what? Living off our parents and avoiding responsibility? If anything, I pitied him. He had no idea what it felt like to work hard, stand on his own, and earn something without a safety net. But that pity didn't erase the resentment I felt toward him either. What made it worse was the memory of the bond James and I used to share. As kids, we were close. We'd stay up late playing video games, build ridiculous pillow forts in the living room, and dream together about what we wanted to be when we grew up. Back then, he was my partner in crime, my best friend. Somewhere along the way, though, that bond disintegrated. Maybe it was the constant favoritism that drove a wedge between us, or maybe it was James's refusal to ever acknowledge how unfair things had been for me. Whatever the reason, the brother I once relied on felt like a stranger now. Amid all this, I couldn't stop wondering, would my parents ever understand how I felt? Could they ever truly see the years of hurt, neglect, and dismissal from my perspective? Or was I just wasting my energy hoping for something they weren't capable of giving? The hardest truth to swallow was the realization that I might never get the closure I wanted. My parents weren't the type to apologize, and James certainly wasn't about to acknowledge his role in all of this. For the first time, I began to think that moving forward might not mean reconciliation. It might mean letting go of the fantasy of a family that saw and valued me equally. Maybe moving forward didn't have to be about cutting ties entirely. Maybe it could just be about choosing peace, accepting that they were who they were and no longer allowing their opinions to define my worth. It was a bittersweet realization, but for the first time, it felt like a step toward freedom. In the days that followed, I tried to focus on the positives. Thanksgiving with Emily's family had given me a glimpse of something I'd never really experienced, a sense of belonging without strings attached. Her parents didn't ask me to prove myself or hold me to impossible standards. They simply welcomed me as I was. I thought back to the warmth of their home, the laughter over a chaotic dinner, and how Emily's mom had pulled me aside to tell me, "You're always welcome here." It wasn't just words, it felt real, genuine. For the first time, I felt like I didn't need to do anything special to earn someone's care. The experience made me question everything I'd ever believed about family. I had spent my whole life assuming that family was a fixed concept, that blood ties were unbreakable, and that no matter what, you had to keep trying. But now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe family wasn't about shared DNA. Maybe it was about the people who showed up for you, who saw you, and who celebrated you without conditions. It also made me reflect on the relationships I'd built outside of my family. Emily, my friends, even a few mentors from work, they had all become constants in my life, people I could count on. And yet, I had spent so much energy chasing the approval of people who had consistently let me down. I thought about reaching out to my parents one more time, to try and explain how much this dynamic had hurt me. But then I stopped myself. Was it really worth it? I'd already laid my feelings bare during our last conversation, and their responses had only reinforced what I already knew: they weren't ready to hear me. Instead, I decided to invest my time and energy in the relationships that brought me peace and joy. I spent more time with Emily and her family, letting myself soak in the kind of love and acceptance I'd always craved. I also started reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in a while, people who had been there for me when I needed them most. Slowly, I began to feel lighter. Letting go of the idea that I had to fix things with my family didn't mean I loved them any less, it just meant I was choosing to love myself more. As the weeks rolled by, something inside me started to change. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, but a quiet, steady shift in how I carried myself. The constant weight of trying to please my family, of proving my worth to people who never seemed to see it, began to lift. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of freedom, a sense that I could finally focus on my own happiness without their approval hanging over me. Emily and I started planning a trip for the holidays, something intimate and peaceful, a cozy cabin tucked away in the woods, just the two of us. It wasn't extravagant or flashy, but it felt perfect. The idea of waking up to snow-covered trees, sipping coffee by the fire, and sharing quiet moments together filled me with a kind of excitement I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the trip, it was about reclaiming the holidays for myself. In the meantime, the storm of messages from my family began to die down. At first, it had been relentless. My mom's guilt-laden monologues, my dad's sharp-edged criticisms, and James's antagonistic jabs flooded my phone daily. But as I refused to engage, their energy seemed to wane. The once-hourly notifications turned into occasional texts, each one a little less frantic than the last. James, however, wasn't ready to let it go. His messages remained consistent, a mix of outright hostility and condescending lectures. One day, he accused me of being a selfish brat who didn't understand the importance of family. The next, he demanded to know when I'd grow up and apologize to our parents for ruining Thanksgiving. It was exhausting to read, but I never responded. I had nothing to say to someone who refused to see the bigger picture. I realized James wasn't just angry at me, he was scared. His world revolved around our parents' approval, the same approval I'd been chasing my whole life. But while I was learning to let go of that toxic cycle, James clung to it with everything he had. My refusal to play along wasn't just a betrayal to him, it was a threat to the fragile ecosystem he'd built his identity around. Instead of being drawn into his drama, I focused on the life I was building. Emily and I started spending more time together, talking about what we wanted for the future. I reached out to friends I hadn't seen in years, reconnecting over coffee and laughter. At work, I threw myself into new projects, rediscovering the satisfaction of being good at something I loved. Each small step felt like progress. For the first time, I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next guilt trip or insult from my family. The hurt they'd caused me hadn't disappeared, but it was beginning to lose its grip. The holiday trip with Emily felt like a turning point. It wasn't just an escape, it was the start of something new. I was redefining what happiness meant, what family meant, and what my life could look like without the constant shadow of their expectations. The process wasn't quick or easy, but with every choice I made for myself, the distance between me and the chaos grew. And for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. Just as I was beginning to feel like I had found some clarity, the universe, or rather, my parents, decided to throw me another curveball. A week before Christmas, my dad called me directly. It wasn't a text or a passive-aggressive group chat message. It was an actual phone call. At first, I hesitated to answer. Part of me wanted to let it ring out, to maintain the silence that had brought me so much peace. But something compelled me to pick up. Maybe it was curiosity or some lingering hope that this time, things might be different. His tone was calm, almost cautious, a stark contrast to the anger in his previous messages. He started by asking how I was doing, a question that caught me off guard. For a moment, it almost sounded like he cared. But as the conversation continued, it became clear there was an agenda. He launched into a story about how Thanksgiving had been off, without me there, how it didn't feel the same. He admitted that James had been difficult. Apparently, his attitude during the trip had caused more tension than anyone expected. My dad didn't outright apologize for the way they treated me, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in his words. "We missed you," he said, and for the first time in a long while, I believed him. But then came the familiar pattern. He pivoted to talking about how my absence had upset my mom and how it was my responsibility to bridge the gap. He didn't use the word apologize, but the implication was clear, it was up to me to make things right. I listened quietly, letting him speak, but I felt a growing frustration. Why was it always my job to fix things? To smooth over the cracks they'd created? When he finally paused, I told him I appreciated the call, but I wasn't ready to have this conversation. I explained, as calmly as I could, that I needed time and space to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with them. There was a long silence on the other end before he said, "Well, just think about it, okay?" His voice was softer now, almost pleading. I hung up feeling a mix of emotions. There was a part of me that wanted to believe this was a step forward, that maybe they were starting to understand. But another part of me knew better. Change like this didn't happen overnight. For now, I was content to keep my distance, focusing on the people and experiences that made me feel whole. The door wasn't closed, but I wasn't ready to reopen it just yet. Christmas came and went quietly, but for the first time, it didn't feel lonely. Emily and I spent the holiday in the cabin, exactly as we'd planned. The snow outside was heavy, muffling the world and making everything feel still and peaceful. We cooked together, laughed over board games, and exchanged simple but thoughtful gifts. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect. During one of those quiet moments by the fire, I reflected on how far I'd come in just a few months. The weight of my family's expectations no longer felt as heavy. I wasn't constantly looking at my phone, dreading the next message or call. For the first time, I felt like I was living for myself, not for anyone else's approval. My dad had followed up once or twice since our call, each time with a gentler tone. He seemed to genuinely want to repair things, but I wasn't rushing to make a decision. I had spent so much of my life trying to force relationships that I now realized weren't entirely healthy. If they wanted to rebuild trust, it would have to be on my terms and with mutual effort. James, on the other hand, had gone silent. Whether it was because he was angry or because he'd finally given up, I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't care. For years, I had bent over backward trying to maintain a bond with someone who saw me as competition rather than a sibling. Letting go of that weight felt like reclaiming a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. As the new year approached, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. I started making plans, small goals at first, like visiting a national park I'd always wanted to see or taking up a new hobby. Emily was by my side, encouraging me to focus on what made me happy. The idea of family still lingered in my mind, but it no longer felt like a question of blood ties. Instead, it was about the people who showed up for me, who celebrated my wins and comforted me in my losses. Whether it was Emily, her family, or my closest friends, I realized I had more support than I'd ever acknowledged. For the first time, I felt hopeful. Hopeful that I could build a life filled with love and connection, even if it didn't look the way I'd always imagined. My relationship with my parents and James was still unresolved, but that was okay. I didn't need all the answers right now. As the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, Emily and I stood outside the cabin, watching the snow fall under the moonlight. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "Here's to a better year." I smiled, knowing she was right. This was the start of something new, something entirely my own.
See you later.